Hey guys, it's Sam, and today I'll be talking about Inner Witch, A Modern Guide to the Ancient Craft by Gabriela Herstik. Now this is the first witch book that I have read. Now before anyone comes for me and says, oh you should have read Cunningham, you should have read Buckland, I specifically didn't because I plan on reading them in the future, but I wanted something that was less Wicca based. I know it still has a ton of value, but I wanted to read something more modern. When I'm reading nonfiction, I like stuff that is just set up more cleanly, not reading like a textbook, not being super dense, and that is something that I would dive into later when I want those more dense topics, but I wanted some more broad overview books at the beginning of the journey for me. A video about my own journey and belief system and things having to do with more secular beliefs and agnostic beliefs and things like that, so I'll link that on the screen for a bit more context. But this is a newer book that's pretty highly recommended. It's also, I know, very like Instagram worthy and a very pretty appealing book in that way. But I wanted to get it because it felt more broad than some of the other more focused, very dense books. So Gabriela Herstik is kind of a sort of like online media personality. I think she has more of an online presence. She also writes like a witchy column for Nylon magazine, and she is of Jewish heritage. So as I mentioned, this book is very broad, and that is one of the reasons why I picked it up. So it gives a very, very brief history of witchcraft, kind of like what it is. It does say how witchcraft is a practice, not a religion, things like that. But I will say that this had much more Wiccan influence than I was expecting. She does talk about that everyone can like choose their own path and things like that, but she does have a lot of different like spells and rituals throughout this, and it has much more of like her influence in it and like a Wiccan influence, because she talks about like casting a circle, which is still important, something that you can do, but the way that she casts a circle is much more like Wiccan, calling in the elements, calling in deities, things like that. So for someone that's more secular, that might not appeal to you, but you can also just skip over those parts. But this does cover a number of broad topics. It talks about like the focus on energy and this all being about energy. There's a whole chapter on tarot. There's a chapter on fashion magic, which I don't see in anything else that I've read thus far, but Gabriela Herstik kind of does focus on fashion and stuff with her own personal life. So that is something that she brings in that's kind of a unique take. Not something that I'm super drawn to, but it's kind of cool to see. There's a small section on green magic and green witchcraft, but again, there's whole books devoted to that. Moon magic, crystals and astrology, and then like building a grimoire and stuff. And then throughout she has little spells, little rituals, little grounding exercises, things like that. So I did tab it up like a bit, but there are definitely giant sections that I just felt like weren't anything that I wanted to reference again, because it is so broad. So I think this is a decent beginner book, just to kind of get introduced very briefly to a lot of the topics, but it's not going to have very in-depth information about any of them. I don't really consider her like an expert in any of them, obviously. It's much more just like her opinion on a lot of stuff, how she does things, here's some of her rituals and her spells and things like that, and a little bit more like guided and stuff. I did have some problems with this book. So there are some things in here that do feel very appropriative. So Gabriela Herstik is not Native American or anything, but basically for all of the cleansing, she says to use Palo Santo or white sage. I know it's very popular and kind of like the go-to for a lot of witches. However, those are both herbs that are sacred to other closed practices. And she also says smudging, and smudging is not something that just anybody can do, say smoke cleansing. Like anyone can smoke cleanse and use any kind of herb that's not Palo Santo or sage. I mean, she has a very small section that does reference other herbs, but basically whenever she says to cleanse, like she says cleanse with Palo Santo or sage, and I'm like, no. There's also some areas that I feel like are not super well researched. Again, this is a very, very broad book. However, when you are appealing to like beginner witches, there's a whole section on the Fae and like how to work with the Fae. Like when I say whole section, it's still small, but she kind of goes through, here's like one type of water Fae, here's one type of earth Fae, and how to like work with them. And I'm like, I know very, very little. However, everyone that I have followed online has basically been like, don't fuck with the Fae. Like there are people that work with like demons that don't fuck with the Fae. So I'm like, don't just tell beginner witches to like dive into working with the Fae. Like that's not smart. So regardless of if you believe in it, because I am very much like, hey, it could be real, it could be not. I'm more lean on the side of no. However, still not something I'm just gonna like fuck with, you know? So there were some elements of that. There's also a very big focus on like the, again, sort of like divine feminine. Not enough to feel like turfy in my opinion, but it is borderline. I think again, because it has that very big Wiccan focus, there's a lot of this like, you know, we as women, like it's definitely written more for like female and like femme people. But I just don't feel like it has to be. I think this is a problem with a lot of witch books, honestly, is that there's a very big focus on femininity and your like womb and stuff, and it's just like, that doesn't, I get that a lot of witches are female and female bodied. However, you don't have to be, not all of them are. And this huge focus on that, while some people can find it really empowering, I feel like there's a place for that. Maybe put that as like a chapter and not as like woven into the whole book. So overall, this was fine. This was a nice little beginner intro, and there were some things that I referenced. Like there are a couple rituals that I could kind of like take myself and work with, and there was a couple things she said that I really liked about like karma and every energy being, you know, like neutral, and it's kind of like what you make it. There's some different like correspondences and stuff. Make your own like cleansing spray I kind of saved. There's a whole like, there's lots of charts about like, this one's chakras, for example. So there's those that I marked mostly, and you know, a lot of what I marked is charts that I would then compare to other resources, but this is not like a wealth of knowledge or anything, and like I said, I did have some problems with it. So this is a very quick read, a nice like beginner intro to kind of see what you wanted to focus more on. For example, I knew I wanted to get more into green witchcraft, I knew I wanted to look into lunar stuff, I know I like tarot, I know I like crystals, I know I like astrology, so all that's in here, and it was a like primer, like very, very basic introduction to that, but then looking into more information about it from other sources. I gave this like 2 to 2.5 stars. It's very middle of the road. I had some issues. I don't think it was like the best written thing, but it's still fun and a very easy beginner book, easy to find, easy to read, easy to get through. Just make sure that if you do get this and you're beginner to check some other sources first before doing like anything she says. So that is it for my review of Inner Witch. Comment down below, let me know your thoughts on this book. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.